Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Lots going on, as one can imagine, and anyone who's been reading the publications coming out of Israel in the last week or so, there's cause for optimism, there's cause for pessimism. I will start perhaps with the optimism. Today, there was something that shouldn't be extraordinary, but certainly has been extraordinary, certainly for the last year and a half, if not longer, where the coalition and opposition came together to vote on a law together. Obviously, there were some laws that were passed in the last government that the opposition joined with, but they were usually relatively insignificant. Today, a law passed, at least through its first reading, actually, there were 8 different laws, each one by a different MK, but that's normal. Usually then they just get sort of pushed together into one law, which sort of, takes the different elements from different of the other laws. But there were pretty much, support from coalition and parts of the opposition for a law to remove citizenship from Israelis or those who have permanent residency, who perform an act of terror and then receive money from the PA, what's called pay for slay, where the Palestinian Authority gives money to terrorists who murder Israelis, and depending how many they murder, they get more money and how long they have to serve. So that was an interesting law, and the fact is that at least Yisrael Beitenu from the opposition and I think even one or two others from other members of the opposition, or many other members of the opposition, abstained or didn't appear and didn't actively vote against. So it shows, even at the beginning of this highly divisive Knesset, this government, that there are elements of the opposition that are prepared to work with what they believe in. The last Knesset was very much about, it doesn't matter what the issues are, doesn't matter what our ideology is, and that goes for both coalition and opposition. We will vote according to coalition lines or opposition lines, and that's basically what happened for that year and a half. So the fact that so early on in this Knesset, and so only days after the swearing of the government, we see a significant law that there was at least some working together between coalition and opposition is certainly room for optimism. Obviously, that is very much shrouded by a heavy dose of pessimism. There is a lot of talk, there has been a lot of talk in Israel of a move towards civil war. Now, Israeli politics has got to the point where you can pretty much say anything, however bad it is. It's never as bad as the comments that come out. Democracy is at stake. Democracy is in danger. There's going to be blood on the streets. There's going to be a civil war. We've heard all these things over the last 2 weeks. None of these things are going to happen. There are, a very strong sense of emotions from both sides. We saw a very large demonstration on Saturday night in Tel Aviv. They say up to 200,000 people took part. There's a lot of controversy about that because obviously while the main issue was the justice, the judicial reform, and basically against the government, that it was hijacked by some more far left groups. And interesting enough, the New Israel Fund, which usually stays in the background, even though it's been proven that they do fund these types of things, actually for the first time seemed to actually take credit and came out openly and said that we did fund some of the organizations that were behind the demonstration. So because of that, I think we see some of the big names in the current opposition, formerly in the coalition, like Benny Gantz, like Yair Lapid, like Avigdor Lieberman, who have said that they will not attend the next demonstration, I believe, which is for this Saturday night in the same place. We'll see if it grows. We'll see if, what sort of level of consistency there will be. New National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir was asked about the demonstrations, and he said that absolutely there's a right to demonstrate, but there's not a right to shut down roads. We see in recent years lots of demonstrators, whether it's from the ultra-Orthodox population, even the disabled groups working on behalf of disabled rights, and all sorts of groups have taken to try and close roads, especially the main artery through Tel Aviv, the Ayalon Road, which has been shut sometimes because of demonstrators. So Itamar Ben-Gvir has given instructions to the police to make sure that doesn't happen. Another demand he made of the police, which actually will not be listened to, is that that there should be no Palestinian flags being waved at the event. The police said that we have no legal right to stop anyone waving a Palestinian flag, and it's certainly not to the point of incitement, which is what Ben-Gvir suggested. So it'll be very interesting to see now that the police have been given at least some stronger instructions from their new boss, whether they will or they will not follow through on it. What's really taken a lot of attention this week is the reform. The judicial reform has been taken up a level. Now some of the details are really being worked out, and they're moving towards a first level going through the legislature, etc., etc. So many of the details are not so different from what we've heard. There will be a majority of politicians or people that the politicians place to decide who will be on the Supreme Court. There will be override. They will certainly lessen the reasonability, which we've spoken about, the clause of reasonability, and other such things. Now, we've heard a lot of arguments from the left and from the right. The question is exactly why now and what can be done about it. So there have been some suggestions that why now. There's a few things. A lot of people are pointing to Netanyahu's 3 cases, which are ongoing. Some others point to Aryeh Deri, whose case to whether he can serve as a minister, even though he took a plea bargain on a criminal offense, whether he can serve actually in 2 ministries, because that's what he's been, that's what he was voted in as health minister and interior minister. But probably the most telling part is the fact that they're trying to do it now to try and get it out of the way as soon as possible, because it is something which, for those proponents of judicial reform, is very, very important. There is an idea that Netanyahu didn't really want to go as far as Yariv Levin has gone and some of the other proponents of judicial reform. And what was very interesting is there was a recent poll which asked questions about the judicial reform, and they kind of, came down according to party lines. Obviously, those opposed were generally Yesh Atid voters, and others in the opposition, and those in favor from the ultra-Orthodox parties and from the religious Zionist parties, or the parties that made up the religious Zionist list. But the most interesting, and the one where it was pretty much evenly split, was the Likud itself. I think there was a slight majority of 47% were in favor of judicial reform and 42% were against it, which means that Likud is the most divided on the issue of judicial reform. And if you look at Likud, while it is seen as a right-wing party and is caricaturized, etc., there are many different elements within the Likud, or there are many different reasons why people vote Likud. There are those who just voted because of the cult of personality of Netanyahu, which some claim, other reasons, but it always was throughout its history a quote-unquote liberal right-wing party, or a liberal party. One of the original parties which made up the Likud in 1977 for those elections was the Liberal Party of Ariel Sharon back in the day. So it has that very much coursing through its veins. And there are a lot of people who are maybe a little bit uncomfortable about some of the elements of judicial reform. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find too many Likud voters who didn't think there should be some judicial reform, but there are certainly a significant amount who believes that some of the clauses are going too far. So what the claim is that Yariv Levin, who's definitely a proponent of a maximalist approach, as we've seen, wants to get this over and done with before perhaps Netanyahu gets cold feet, perhaps there's too many problems in the coalition, perhaps, if you put it a year or two down the line, and we get closer to elections, maybe he feels that he would lose some of his support if he supported such drastic, or what some would call draconian measures to the justice system. So to do it now means that you get that over and done with before there's really a reason to stop it. But there certainly is a certain amount of disquiet within the Likud, not just within the rank and file supporters, but even within some of the MKs. Now, the question is that everybody's asking in the media, when they're asking the opposition, is why don't you sit down and negotiate? And perhaps they'll give a little, you'll give a little. Yair Lapid, opposition leader, formerly only 2 weeks ago, or less, or whenever it was, Prime Minister, basically said, he basically said, this is a gun to our head, and these are people who are criminals or indicted, and you don't negotiate with people who are doing it for all the wrong reasons. If there was a real conversation to be had, then perhaps it could be different. So it seems he's taking also a maximalist approach. And at this point in time, at least, he has shown absolutely no interest in negotiating, even coming up with his own reforms, because I think there, even in the center left, there is an understanding that there needs to be some reforms. The interesting character in all this is Benny Gantz. We've talked about Benny Gantz quite a lot, and I spoke to some people in the Knesset even today who said to me there is still that belief that Benny Gantz will come in eventually. Benny Gantz is one of the few figures who, while slamming the proposals by Levin, has said that he would be happy to take part in some sort of debate on it, to discuss the proposals. So he's taken a far more moderate position on this, perhaps because at some point he needs to find his way in. So he needs to, not come down on a maximalist or antagonistic attitude towards the judicial reform. But it's clear that, again, politics are very much, being played out at this point. While this is all taking place, we've spoken a lot about general politics and Israeli politics in particular, and even someone who's really a master of it is Prime Minister Netanyahu, is the deflect and distraction tactic. So tonight, he and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich followed through on some of their campaign promises on the cost of living, which really, well beyond the judicial reform, is really the issue which the average Israeli cares about more than anything else, which is true pretty much of citizens around the world because of inflation, because of global events. Israel, like many other countries, is seeing skyrocketing prices, etc., etc. So tonight, a plan was revealed by the Prime Minister and Finance Minister to try and have an effect on that. One of the things was to freeze municipal taxes. Another was to lessen the expected rise in water, electricity, and gas prices. And there's some other things in there. Some of the things which were not in there, which were promised, are, for example, free education from 0 to 3 for working families. That wasn't in there. There wasn't any of the more drastic promises that really were at the center of, especially the Likud campaign. We didn't hear anything from it. Doesn't mean we won't hear from anything of it, but the numbers have been crunched by the economists, and they say it's really a pipe dream financially. So it's no surprise it was in there. So the conversation, the government is trying to take the conversation back towards the cost of living to try and show that it's not all about judicial reform, because the questions that are being asked by many is, of all the issues that are on the table, is judicial reform the most urgent? Well, that goes back to the previous conversation. For some, it is the most urgent because Yair Levin, Simcha Rothman, who we had earlier on in the week briefly, for them, it is at the base of everything that happens in Israel. And unless there's judicial reform, they believe that they will not be able to get their agenda moving as soon as possible. So the fact that they did it really, really early on in the life of this government shouldn't be a surprise, because some of the other issues are going to push it aside as we move further into this government. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on any of the issues I've spoken about or anything else.
All right, thank you so much. The first one is from Carrie Hillebrand asking, did the presence of radical parties in the coalition impact on last week's Negev Forum? What do you make of Jordan's ongoing declining to participate?
Well, it didn't really have, this was organized a long time before. The Negev Forum obviously was formulated under the Lapid government, and this date had been sort of set in stone even for some months. So a lot of the working groups and the meetings didn't really discuss domestic politics. I'm sure some of the higher level meetings that are taking place and some of the phone calls that are taking place will mention, especially, in the Arab world, the status of Jerusalem and the holy site and the so-called status quo on the Temple Mount. These are issues which are being brought up again and again. But this was really a meeting of director generals, of ministers. It was very much professional staff rather than political staff. And they were discussing things like tolerance and energy, cooperation, even defense and things like that. So domestic politics does not come up. Jordan's absence is not too much of a surprise at this point. They don't want to be seen too much in this Negev Forum, in this circle. There was a lot of talk about them, and there was a message that really, they want the Jordanians in. The Jordanians would prefer to come in with the Palestinians. There are no particular official problems with that, but obviously the Palestinians aren't going to come. They were against the Abraham Accords from the beginning, and they felt that a lot of this focus, whether it's the Abraham Accords and Negev Forum, is a distraction from the Palestinian issue. So they're not going to come at this point, which means that it's harder for Jordan to come. But who knows? Maybe the next meeting, I believe, will be in Morocco in the coming months. Perhaps by then there'll be some movement.
Thank you so much. Larry White asked, does Netanyahu's appeal still stem from his brother's heroism in the Entebbe raid?
No, not now. One could certainly make the argument, and many have, that was his in Israeli politics, and certainly he doesn't spare any opportunity to mention his brother Yoni and his heroism in the Entebbe mission. But by now, Benjamin Netanyahu is a far bigger personality figure, than his brother. It helps him, and as I said, he brings it up regularly, especially when appropriate. But by now, there's no one who votes for or supports Netanyahu because of Yoni Netanyahu.
Understood. Thank you. Reuven Hawk asks, Gideon Sar and Ayelet Shaked, as justice ministers, also tried to enact some type of judicial reform. Do you know what their enactments were?
Well, in the end, it didn't really happen because of pressures. Simply, they didn't have the support. This is very much a right-wing issue, although both of those people that you mentioned are on the right of the political spectrum, and they are supportive. As I said, there are quite a few people in the opposition. Ayelet Shaked is no longer in the Knesset at all, but Gideon Sa'ar certainly is. But there is a lot of people who do believe in the opposition that there should be some level of reform. There's very few people who believe it should be left exactly as it is, because there are problems with the current system, and everyone sees the problems with the current system. Usually people have stayed away from it because there is this feeling, if you touch it a little bit, then that just, where's it going to stop? So many people have come into the justice ministry, including those two, who have talked about some level of reform, but really haven't enacted anything specific, or certainly as large a reform infrastructure that Levin is talking about. And perhaps that's why he's coming in really, really heavy-handed, maybe because he understands that he may not be able to get everything he wants. And don't forget, there is a process here. It will go through the Knesset. There will be votes. It will have to go back to the committee. I mean, the relevant committee, the Law and Justice Committee, is run by probably the biggest proponent, which is Simcha Rotman, of the judicial reforms. I don't think it'll have too many problems going through there, but there will be a debate. And it could be that maybe not everything which is in the initial reading of the first draft of this law will make it into law in the end. There are people trying to negotiate behind the scenes, So far, the people who come out publicly against it are using mostly superlatives. This is going to end democracy. This is going to be the tyranny of the majority. This is going to lead to civil war. This is going to leave no checks and balances. All these sort of extreme, which I get from a public relations point of view. But behind the scenes, it's a lot more moderate, trying to see if they can maybe, for example, basic laws, the override clause, maybe instead of 61, which is a basic majority, which every government will have, maybe make it greater. But then you have a problem. Where do you draw the line? People are saying, well, if you have 70, because most governments, certainly not in a while, have had a 70 majority. And if you call for a 70 majority, that means that this government will not be able to do that because it only has a majority of 64. So it's unlikely that this particular government will agree to such a thing. And also don't forget, the opposition knows if it ever wants to get into government and it wants to pass basic laws and it wants to override certain laws, no politician really is going to vote against limiting itself. So there are all these factors to be taken into account. We'll see how much wiggle room there is, if anyone's really going to come to the table with a serious counter offer to the reform, which perhaps is the best way of trying to at least get something in there to bring it from Levin's maximalist position back towards some of those voices which are not against any reform, but would like to see a lesser reform than Justice Minister Levin is talking about at the moment.
Understood. Len Levin asked if you happen to have read the Washington Street Journal's article by Yohanan Plesner today, and if so, do you have any reaction to the proposed changes to the powers of the Supreme Court that he mentioned?
I actually didn't, because I don't have I actually opened it, but as I don't have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal, I just caught the headline in the opening paragraph. So it did seem like it was Yohanan Plesner is the head of the Israel Democracy Institute, which, does try and come up with sensible, constructive, objections, or not even objections, suggestions to things. So I don't know what was in the article itself, but it did seem like it was an attempt to try and, as I said, what I was trying to get at literally with the last question is that I think the more sensible voices who are saying, okay, everybody, or not everybody, the majority does see the need for some sort of reform. So let's come up with something which leaves some checks and balances and gives the judicial system some say over what's going to happen, and not go too far over to giving, far, far greater control to the politicians. So I can't comment on what was in it, but, usually he comes up with very constructive suggestions.
Thank you so much. So just out of going back to your first point, out of curiosity, is this a breath of fresh air for the Israeli people with the coalition and the opposition agreeing for this law? I remember last year we were talking about something that should have been easily passed that wasn't.
Right. I think what you're referring to are the takanot, how do you say that? The sort of laws which govern the legal status of Israelis who live over the Green Line. As we know, Israelis who live in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, live outside a sovereign state of Israel. So there has to be certain laws which were enacted for many decades, every, I think it's 5 years, I think it was, or 6 months. I can't remember what it is, but it basically passed with an overwhelming majority every time. But this was used as a bit of a political stick between the two, because ironically, the right-wing party didn't want to support it at the time. And that's one of the reasons that we went to elections, because it was felt that was endangering the legal status, and could have, in theory at least, this was one of the cries, that it would have let security prisoners out of jails, Palestinian security prisoners, etc., etc. So, something like that, where the right wing wouldn't refuse to vote for it, shows really that was the most blatant example of how parties or groups of parties were voting against their ideology just to try and win the wider political war. The vote this morning, I think, does show that there is an understanding that really should be in the past. I mean, again, from this particular point of view, you can argue that it was the opposition, because obviously the coalition is going to vote for something like this. But the fact that there were members of the opposition that didn't reflexively just vote against it, even though, for example, someone like Avigdor Lieberman is very much hawkish on these issues, more hawkish, arguably, than Netanyahu himself and certain other members of the Likud. So it would be voting against his ideology. So the fact that someone like Avigdor Lieberman instructed his members to not only write a similar law, but support the other laws, shows that, you know, there won't be that attitude of just voting against just because it's the other side of the aisle. It bodes well, hopefully, for the future, that there are parties of the opposition will vote according to the merits of the law rather than just a political situation. Perhaps it's an understanding that because this government has a 64 majority of parties which are quite content to sit with each other, even though there is sniping amongst the parties and there's certainly disagreements, that this coalition isn't going anywhere. So, you know, try and at least, there's no real sense in trying to bring down the government at this point because it simply will not fall. So perhaps it's just, to a certain extent, that's what's been taken into account. But again, I prefer to be an optimist, and I prefer to look at the glass half full, and perhaps this is, a sign of things to come. The opposition is working together. There was, again, that photo of Yair Lapid, the leader of opposition, with the major leaders of the opposition, except for Ayman Odeh of the United Arab List. You had obviously Gantz, you had Lapid, you had Michaeli, you had Lieberman, and Abbas. So there is an attempt to try and show some unity amongst the opposition, but it's clear that when you have such a wide variety of ideologies, they worked quite well together in government, but in opposition, it seems that they're going to be allowed, or they're going to allow themselves wiggle room to vote on certain laws, even against the whip, as it were.
Thank you so much for that. Robert Larrick asks, in that Jordan has represented the Palestinians in the past, could they be a part of a new, more regional peace plan with Israel?
Jordan? The last time the Jordanians represented the Palestinians was in 1991 at the Madrid Peace Conference. And ever since then, the Palestinians have pretty much represented themselves. They're seen as an independent player on the international scene. So I don't see a reversal to those days. Jordan, let's not forget, the vast majority of Jordanian citizens are Palestinians, and the Jordanian king is certainly cognizant of that, and there's a lot of pressure, and he has his parliament, which is a lot more hawkish than he is, so he has to sort of, tread on that tightrope very, very carefully. And while the Negev Forum is very nice and there's some very meaningful things going on, Jordan have their in whenever they want it, but certainly at the moment they're looking at this and thinking, it wouldn't look so good if we go to this regional event without the Palestinians, without talk of the Palestinians, without talk of a Palestinian-Israeli peace process, with what they would describe as the most right-wing Israeli government in history. Do they want to be seen as giving a reward to that? So all these factors are in place. So it's not a big shock that Jordan are not represented. And the idea that they will come to a future event representing themselves and the Palestinians, I think is just pushing us back over 3 decades, which simply will not happen at this point.
Understood. Thank you so much. And with that, we have come to the close of our webinar and podcast. So Ashley, thank you so much for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern with Jonathan Shanzer discussing the Abraham Accords and Jordan's unsustainable position. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.